Vanessa Cole thought she had everything under control, until she whispered her plans for revenge to her personal trainer, believing her husband Ethan was too busy to notice. But Ethan had been listening, and he wasn't the man she thought he was. Now, in a courtroom battle that would shake her to her core, everything she thought she knew about betrayal is about to unravel. What Ethan has done will leave her speechless, and nothing will be the same again. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted? How did it change you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's reflect together on the price of trust and revenge. I'm Ethan Cole, 42 years old, and this is the story of how betrayal turned my life upside down, and how I fought back in the most unexpected way. Ethan Cole, at 42 years old, had spent years building a tech empire from the ground up. His office in downtown Seattle reflected his success, a sleek, modern space filled with glass and steel, the kind of place that screamed power and wealth. But today, none of that mattered. Sitting across from his wife Vanessa in the law office, Ethan felt like everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. Vanessa entered the room with a sharp, confident stride. At 35, she was stunning, her platinum blonde hair pulled back into a sleek chignon, her black Armani suit fitting her perfectly. She exuded the kind of confidence that made everyone else in the room feel small, even the top divorce attorney she had hired, Tyler Grant. As she walked past Ethan, she didn't even glance at him. Instead, her attention was fully on her attorney, and she whispered something to him that made Tyler's eyes widen slightly. The tension in the room thickened. Ethan's stomach sank. He had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, the reality of it felt unbearable. His wife, his once loving wife, was preparing to take everything. As she sat down beside Tyler, Ethan couldn't help but notice the smug smile on her face. She was ready. She had been planning this for months. Every glance, every gesture, every word she spoke made it clear that she saw this divorce as nothing more than a financial transaction. "I've been ready for months," Vanessa said, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. Ethan tried to ignore the chill in her tone, but it stung. This was the woman he had built his life with, the woman he had trusted more than anyone. Now she was determined to tear it all down. Ethan knew exactly what she was after. The financial disclosures had shown their marital estate worth $850 million, 0 cents, nearly half of it belonging to him, earned through years of blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. And Vanessa? She was going to take it all. Or so she thought. The realization that she had been plotting his downfall was the final blow. She wasn't just seeking a settlement. She was seeking revenge. For years, she had resented Ethan's long hours, his work obsession, his inability to pay attention to her needs. In her mind, this was her moment of triumph. Vanessa's attorney, Tyler, leaned forward, his voice smooth. "Mrs. Cole, based on preliminary financial disclosures, we're looking at a marital estate worth approximately $850 million. 0 cents. Washington state law entitles you to a significant portion." Vanessa's smile widened. "I've been ready for months, Tyler. The question is whether my soon-to-be ex-husband is prepared to pay for thinking he could ignore me for 5 years." Ethan clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his face impassive. It was the first time she had said something so openly cruel. She had been calculating this for months, and now, she was about to get everything. At least, that's what she thought. What she didn't know was that Ethan had already turned the tables in a way she could never have anticipated. Across the table, Ethan's lawyer, Margaret Chen, quietly examined her notes, her silver hair framing her composed face. The woman had seen it all in her 30 years of legal experience, but Ethan's plan was something different. Margaret glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Cole, are you absolutely certain about this approach? Once we proceed, there's no going back?" Ethan nodded, his eyes focused on the papers in front of him. There was no turning back now, but he wasn't worried. He had been preparing for this moment long before Vanessa had even filed for divorce. "I'm certain, Margaret. Let's get this over with." What Vanessa couldn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand, was that everything she thought she was about to take was already gone. 3 months earlier, Ethan had discovered something that had shifted the entire course of their marriage. It had shattered his trust in her, but more importantly, it had turned him into someone capable of revenge on a scale she couldn't comprehend. As he sat there, listening to Vanessa speak about what she was entitled to, Ethan's mind raced. He could see her smiling, see her preparing for the wealth she thought she would inherit. But deep down, he knew she was already too late. The game was over, and she didn't even know it yet. 3 months before that fateful day in the law office, Ethan Cole's life had been turned upside down. It started with a sound. Vanessa's laughter. It was the kind of sound he hadn't heard in months, the kind of laughter that used to fill their home with warmth and love. But that evening, it was different. It wasn't the playful, carefree laughter they used to share. It was something colder, more calculated. Ethan's curiosity got the better of him, and he quietly slipped downstairs, trying not to make a sound as he moved toward the kitchen. He thought maybe she was watching something funny on her phone or talking to a friend, but as he stepped into the doorway, the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. There, standing near the kitchen counter, was Vanessa, her arms wrapped around a man Ethan didn't recognize. They were laughing together, close, too close. The man's athletic build and confident smile made Ethan's heart skip a beat, a sudden stab of jealousy and fear cutting through him. His mind raced. Who was this person? Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away. Vanessa and the man, Marcus, her personal trainer, were lost in each other. They weren't just talking. They were whispering in a way that felt too intimate, too familiar. Ethan could feel his stomach twist as he realized the gravity of what was unfolding in front of him. He didn't move a muscle. He just stood there in silence, watching the scene in front of him. Then he heard Vanessa's voice, low and enticing, as she spoke to Marcus. "I can't wait much longer, Marcus," she said, her tone filled with a kind of excitement. "The divorce papers are almost finalized. By Christmas, I'll be free and rich, and we can finally be together. No more secrets." Ethan's heart dropped. His own wife, his partner for 15 years, was planning his destruction. Speaking of their marriage with such coldness, it wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was a calculated scheme. Vanessa had already set her sights on her future, one that didn't include him. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "By Christmas I'll be free," she had said, and it felt like the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. As he stood frozen in the doorway, watching his wife plan the end of their life together, the weight of the betrayal hit him all at once. The sting was sharp, deep, and painful, but something inside Ethan shifted. His mind wasn't clouded with anger or heartbreak. Instead, a cold realization washed over him. Vanessa hadn't just been planning to leave him. She had been planning to destroy him, to take everything he had worked so hard for without a second thought. But Ethan wasn't the same man he used to be. In that moment, something inside him clicked. The man who had spent years building a tech empire from the ground up, the man who had sacrificed so much for his success, wasn't going to let this go unchallenged. Instead of confronting Vanessa and giving her the satisfaction of a fight, Ethan turned on his heel and quietly retreated to his home office. The sound of Vanessa and Marcus's laughter still echoed in his ears, but now it was only fuel for the fire that had just been ignited inside him. Ethan sat down at his desk, his mind racing as he replayed everything he had just witnessed. But it wasn't anger that fueled him. It was something else. This wasn't about confronting Vanessa or making her feel guilty. No, Ethan was far beyond that now. This was about justice. This was about making sure that someone who had betrayed him, someone who had torn apart the life they had built together, wouldn't get away with it. Not now, not ever. What Vanessa didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that Ethan was already 3 steps ahead. She thought she was in control, that she had the upper hand, that she was about to walk away with everything. But Ethan had made sure that wasn't going to happen. The game had already been set in motion, and Vanessa had no idea what she was walking into. Ethan wasn't about to lose everything. Instead, he was about to turn her betrayal into his greatest triumph. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the computer screen, his mind racing. The betrayal he had just witnessed, the laughter he couldn't erase from his mind, had left him feeling hollow. But now, a new emotion had taken root within him: determination. He wasn't just going to let Vanessa take everything from him. No, he was going to make sure she paid for every lie, every plan she had put in motion. Over the following weeks, Ethan took control. He moved quickly, methodically, making sure that everything he had worked for would be out of reach when the divorce proceedings started. It was a careful, calculated maneuver that required precision. Ethan knew he had to be quick. Vanessa, blinded by greed and the belief that she was about to inherit his empire, would never suspect a thing. He started with the simplest step, transferring every asset he owned into his mother's name. It was a decision that felt like a weight lifted from his shoulders, but also like a final severing of the ties that bound him to his wife. Ethan had been successful enough to amass an empire, but now, he needed to protect it. And there was no better person to help him do that than his mother, Linda. Ethan had always known that Linda didn't trust Vanessa. She had never come out and said it directly, but Ethan could see it in the way she looked at his wife during family gatherings. She'd always been polite, but there was a subtle unease in her eyes whenever Vanessa was around. Ethan trusted her completely. Linda was sharp, strategic, and, above all, she understood the importance of protecting what was theirs, and that was exactly what she helped him do. Together, they devised a brilliant strategy. Ethan's assets were transferred legally, meticulously, and with complete attention to detail. The house in Belworth, $12 million, 0 cents. It now belonged to Linda, with Ethan listed as the caretaker with signing privileges. The vacation home in Aspen, that was now Linda's property, with Ethan as the designated manager. The hundreds of millions in tech company stocks, they were now held in a trust with Linda as the sole beneficiary and Ethan as the trustee. Each transfer was fully executed, notarized, and recorded with the appropriate agencies. It was a flawless plan, one that would leave Vanessa with nothing. But it wasn't just the asset transfers that made this plan so brilliant. The timing was everything. Ethan knew that Vanessa was planning to file for divorce first. She thought she had him cornered, that she could play the victim and take everything she could from him. What she didn't know was that Ethan had already made sure that everything she thought she was entitled to was already gone. When she filed for divorce, she would be faced with a completely different financial picture, one that had been carefully crafted to her detriment. As the divorce papers moved forward, Ethan's lawyer, Margaret Chen, continued to prepare for the battle ahead. She was an expert in the field, with decades of experience in divorce law. But as she reviewed the case and the financial disclosures, there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. It was as if she could sense that there was more going on beneath the surface. Ethan had been clear with her. He didn't want to fight about his assets. He wanted to protect his legacy, his work, and, most importantly, his dignity. Margaret had asked Ethan several times if he was sure about his approach. She was no stranger to legal battles, but she also understood that once they moved forward with this strategy, there would be no turning back. Ethan's response was always the same. "I'm certain. Let's do this." It was clear that Ethan was no longer the man he had been when he married Vanessa. He had gone from a man who had trusted and loved his wife to a man who understood that trust had been shattered. The man who once believed in the sanctity of marriage and partnership had now become someone focused on ensuring that justice would be served, not through anger but through a calculated and strategic plan. Vanessa had no idea what she was walking into. Her lawyer, Tyler Grant, had been building their case based on financial disclosures that were already outdated and completely inaccurate. Tyler thought he had the upper hand, that he had Ethan cornered. What he didn't know was that Ethan had already set the stage for the perfect legal trap. The moment they walked into that courtroom, it would be a different game entirely. Ethan sat back in his chair, watching the rain fall outside his office window. The pieces were all in place. The plan was perfect. Vanessa had no idea what was coming for her, and when she stepped into that courtroom, expecting victory, she would discover that everything she thought she could take was already gone. The game had already been won. The courtroom was tense as the divorce proceedings continued. Vanessa, sitting confidently next to her lawyer, Tyler Grant, was prepared to claim half of Ethan's empire. Ethan remained composed, his face revealing nothing, as his lawyer, Margaret Chen, reviewed the documents. The tension between the two sides was palpable, but what Vanessa didn't know was that Ethan had already executed a masterstroke that would leave her with nothing. Judge Carter, an experienced divorce judge, called the case to order. The proceedings started with Vanessa's lawyer outlining their case. He spoke of Ethan's wealth, his tech empire, and the assets they were entitled to under Washington state law. Vanessa's face radiated confidence as she listened, the thought of walking away with millions already dancing in her mind. But Ethan remained quiet, his mind already focused on the next phase of his plan. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he stood calmly and handed over his financial disclosure to the court. Vanessa leaned forward in anticipation, eager to see how much she would take. She knew it would be a large sum, but she didn't expect what happened next. Judge Carter scanned the documents before looking up with surprise. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice steady, "according to these documents, your net worth is zero." Vanessa's eyes widened. She blinked in disbelief, hoping she had misheard the judge. "Zero?" she repeated under her breath. The room grew still. Tyler Grant's eyes narrowed as he looked at the documents again, a sense of unease creeping into the room. Ethan remained calm, his eyes fixed on Vanessa. "That's correct," he said quietly. "I transferred everything to my mother 6 weeks ago. It's all hers now." The room was silent. Vanessa's confident smirk faltered. She had been so sure that she was about to claim everything, but now it seemed like the ground had shifted beneath her. Judge Carter turned the documents over, her expression neutral as she read through the fine details. "The transfer of assets was properly executed and recorded," she said, looking up at Vanessa. "You're entitled to nothing." The shock in Vanessa's eyes was undeniable. Her lawyer, Tyler Grant, was already speaking, demanding an investigation into what he now believed to be fraudulent asset transfers. But the judge wasn't swayed. "I'm afraid," Judge Carter continued, "that the asset transfers were legal. Mr. Cole is within his rights to transfer his assets as he sees fit." Vanessa's gaze shifted to Ethan, and she finally understood. Everything she thought was hers, her dreams of luxury, revenge, and freedom, had been taken away in a single stroke of genius by the man she had betrayed. "Mr. Cole," Judge Carter addressed Ethan again, "the court finds no grounds for the division of assets. Divorce is granted without the division of property." Vanessa was left speechless, her dreams shattered in an instant. Tyler Grant's face showed a mix of disbelief and frustration, but it was too late. Ethan had already outplayed them both. As the court session ended, Vanessa sat frozen, trying to process the overwhelming reality. She had underestimated Ethan. He had turned the tables, and now he was walking away with everything, not just the assets, but his dignity, his justice, and his peace. In the weeks that followed the court ruling, Vanessa's life completely unraveled. What she had hoped would be the dawn of a new, glamorous chapter in her life quickly turned into a harsh reality. Marcus, the man she had pinned all her hopes on, disappeared as soon as the ink on the divorce papers had dried. The man who had promised her an escape from her troubles vanished without a trace, taking everything he had taken from her: her trust, her hope, and her belief in the future she thought they would build together. Vanessa was left to face the fallout of her actions alone. The apartment she had rented, a supposed temporary solution, was far from the luxury she had once envisioned. It was small, cramped, and as the days dragged on, the reality of her situation became impossible to ignore. The designer furniture and accessories she had imagined filling a spacious penthouse were nowhere to be found. Instead, she had a few mismatched pieces of furniture she could barely afford, and a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. The dream life she had once seen as her due had quickly turned into a nightmare. She had imagined herself living in a high-rise downtown, enjoying the lavish lifestyle she had envisioned after divorcing Ethan. Instead, she found herself scrubbing floors at a high-end boutique, earning wages so low they barely covered her expenses. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her. Her former life of privilege now felt as though it belonged to someone else. She had traded her marriage, her wealth, and her integrity for nothing but a false promise of a life of freedom and luxury. The job she had taken at the boutique, the one she had once thought was beneath her, was now her only way of making ends meet. It was as though the world she had once been a part of had moved on without her, leaving her stranded in a place she had never thought she would be. The more she tried to convince herself that this was just a temporary setback, the more she realized it wasn't. This was her life now. Her friends, the ones who had once supported her in her plan, had either disappeared or had their own issues to attend to. The luxury car she had dreamed of owning now seemed as distant as the life she had planned. The villa in Tuscany, the vacations around the world, those dreams were now nothing more than fantasies. What was left was an apartment she couldn't afford and a job she resented, neither of which could ever fill the hole left by her misplaced ambition. Meanwhile, Ethan was thriving. The man she had betrayed, the man she thought she could easily manipulate, was not only surviving but flourishing in the wake of their divorce. Ethan had found peace, something Vanessa couldn't even fathom in her current state. He was no longer weighed down by the toxic marriage that had once consumed him. His life had become everything he had hoped for when he first married Vanessa, but now it was on his terms. Ethan had refocused his energy, his attention, and his time. His tech empire continued to grow, and every part of his life seemed to be falling into place. Where Vanessa had expected to see Ethan broken and devastated, what she saw instead was a man who had become stronger, more focused, and more in control than he had ever been during their marriage. Ethan had rebuilt his life, focusing not only on the business he had started from scratch, but also on his own personal growth. He was living for himself, not for anyone else's expectations or needs. The weight of betrayal had shifted from Ethan's shoulders to Vanessa's, and it was clear that he had come out the victor. His reputation among his colleagues and friends had only improved. The business world respected him for his ability to adapt, rebuild, and move forward. Ethan wasn't just surviving, he was thriving in a way that Vanessa never thought possible. And what truly made him successful wasn't just his wealth or career, it was the inner peace he had finally achieved. The most remarkable part of Ethan's transformation, however, was his ability to forgive, not for Vanessa's sake, but for his own. He understood that he couldn't hold on to the bitterness of his past if he wanted to move forward. And as he continued to build his future, he realized that the betrayal that had once threatened to destroy him had ultimately been the catalyst for his greatest success. It was a painful lesson, but it was one he was grateful for, because it allowed him to become the man he was always meant to be. And as he looked around at the life he had built from the ground up, he knew that walking away from Vanessa had been the best decision he could have ever made. Vanessa's downfall had been swift and complete, but for Ethan, the lessons of the past had paved the way for a future more rewarding than he could have imagined. 6 months after the divorce, Ethan's life had taken a turn for the better. He was no longer trapped in the web of lies and manipulation that had defined his marriage. His days had a new rhythm, filled with the peaceful solitude of his apartment. No more distractions, no more arguments, just the freedom to focus on what mattered: his own future. One afternoon, while browsing in a local hardware store, Ethan bumped into Danny, Carmen's cousin. The familiar face was a surprise, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of curiosity. They hadn't spoken since the divorce, and Ethan wasn't sure what Danny's intentions were. "Hey, Ethan," Danny greeted him with a hesitant smile. "How have you been?" Ethan smiled back, his voice steady. Good. Life's been moving forward. How about you?" Danny seemed to hesitate, as if he was unsure whether to continue the conversation. "Could be better, honestly," he said, glancing around nervously. "There's something I think you should know." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What's going on?" Danny lowered his voice, clearly reluctant to speak. "Well, you've probably heard about Vanessa, right?" Ethan nodded, though he already had an inkling of what was coming. "I'm listening." "Things have gone south for her," Danny continued, glancing around the store again. "The house is in foreclosure. She's living in a small apartment now, nothing like what she had before." Ethan took in the news calmly, his face betraying no emotion. "I figured as much," he said, his tone measured. "And Marcus?" "Disappeared," Danny said with a sigh. "He took everything he could and left. No goodbye, no explanation. He just vanished. Vanessa's on her own now, trying to deal with the mess she's in. She even called me once, asking about you. But yeah, it's been a rough time for her." Ethan stood there for a moment, absorbing the information. "She did this to herself," he said quietly, though it wasn't said with malice. "She made her choices, and I made mine. There's nothing more to be said." Danny shifted uncomfortably, sensing that Ethan wasn't interested in further details. "I just wanted you to know," he offered. "Vanessa's family's been talking about how much she regrets everything now, how things turned out. She's not in a good place, man." Ethan nodded but said nothing more. He wasn't interested in Vanessa's regrets. She had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Danny cleared his throat. "I'm just passing along what I know," Danny said awkwardly, trying to break the tension. "I just figured maybe you'd want to hear it from someone who's been around." Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging Danny's effort. "Thanks, but I'm fine, really." The two men exchanged some small talk before parting ways. As Ethan walked back to his car, he couldn't help but reflect on what Danny had told him. He already knew that Vanessa's life had fallen apart, but hearing the details of her downfall made it all feel final. It was hard to deny the bitter irony. She had spent months planning his destruction, celebrating her imminent fortune, and yet now she was left with nothing. The man who had been in the way of her dreams was gone, but so were the dreams she had once cherished. Ethan didn't take satisfaction in her pain. Instead, he felt a quiet satisfaction in his own peace. Over the past months, Ethan had learned one of the most difficult lessons of his life. The pain of betrayal had been deep, but it had led him to this moment of clarity. He had walked away. He hadn't fought or tried to salvage something that wasn't worth saving. He had simply taken control of his own future. Vanessa's downfall, as devastating as it was for her, had taught him the value of self-respect. No one could take away his peace if he refused to let them. And now, he had a life that was free of manipulation and deceit. It was his life, built on his terms, and for the first time in a long while, he could breathe easy. As he sat in his car, preparing to drive back to his apartment, Ethan realized that his journey wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about reclaiming himself. He was no longer the man who had been consumed by the toxicity of his marriage. He was someone who had found strength in walking away, in letting go of the past. He smiled to himself as he started the engine. For the first time in a long while, Ethan knew that everything would be okay. Ethan sat in his apartment, the weight of everything that had happened settling in his chest. The sun had just set and the cool evening light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. He hadn't felt this calm in months. Despite everything that had happened, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the pain, he had come out the other side, not just surviving, but ready for something new. His phone buzzed on the coffee table beside him. It was Vanessa. Again. Ethan stared at the screen for a moment before picking it up. He knew exactly what it would say. Every message had been the same for the past few weeks. "I'm sorry, I made a mistake, we can fix this." He had read them all, trying to decipher whether there was any truth left in her words, but each time the same emptiness filled him. He'd spent years investing in that marriage, believing the best in her, giving her every piece of his heart, only to have it thrown back in his face. The lies, the deceit, the way she had planned his downfall with Marcus, it was more than betrayal, it was a systematic destruction of everything they had built. He hit block on her message without a second thought. Vanessa had been calling for a second chance, and for weeks he had hesitated. But now he was sure. There was nothing left to fix. He had already tried that. He let out a deep breath, looking around at his apartment. It wasn't much yet, but it was his. Everything in it was his choice. There was no one here who had taken something from him. No one here who had broken his trust. It was simple. It was his space to rebuild, to grow. It was the beginning of something that would be his, without anyone else to manipulate or take from him. The phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't Vanessa. It was an email from a venture capital firm he had been working with. Ethan opened it, scanning through the message, his heart beating faster as he read. "Mr. Cole, we've reviewed your proposal and are excited to move forward. We would love to discuss next steps and how we can begin the partnership." Ethan couldn't help the grin that spread across his face. This was it. This was the new beginning he had worked so hard for. The chance to prove to himself that he could rise from the ashes of his past. No more drama, no more manipulation, no more betrayal. He set the phone down and stood up, pacing the room. It had taken him so long to get here, and he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth having ever was. But this time, it would be different. He wouldn't have to look over his shoulder, wondering if someone was trying to take everything he had worked for. He walked over to the window, looking out at the city. For the first time in a long time, the future looked bright. It wasn't clouded by lies or deceit. It wasn't tied to a marriage that had fallen apart. It was all his to shape, to build, to mold into something that was his. He wasn't defined by the past anymore. The phone buzzed again, this time with a text from a new contact. A patent attorney named Sarah Martinez, someone he had met at a recent tech conference. The message was simple. "Dinner tonight. I found this great place downtown." A smile tugged at his lips. He hadn't even realized how lonely he had been until now. The thought of meeting someone new, of starting fresh, was exciting. He grabbed his jacket, ready to meet Sarah. This wasn't just a dinner. It was the start of something new. Something that was his own. No strings attached. No baggage from a broken marriage. Just a chance to move forward. As he stepped outside, he felt a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in years. He was finally on his own terms, not weighed down by the manipulation or the broken trust of his past. His life was his to shape. The phone buzzed once more, but this time he didn't even glance at it. His future was ahead of him, not behind. Ethan Cole walked confidently into the night, knowing that the next chapter of his life was just beginning. There would be challenges, of course, but he was ready for them. This time, the game would be played on his terms. He walked away from the past, not in anger or regret, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally learned the true value of letting go. The road ahead was his to pave, and he was more than ready to walk it.